repeat the whole intro. Hi everyone, thank you very much for joining. I don't have anyone calling in yet, so if you have any kind of question to get us started, dear people in the chat, that would be great, especially if you feel like you have any kind of off-topic question, because I kind of want to give everyone a couple more minutes to join in before we start with the serious stuff. Just let me know what you've been wondering about. What would be super interesting for me is if you just told me where you found out about this stream, because I'm always not quite sure how many people use the email newsletter to find out about Citybond, how many people read it on Reddit or on Twitter. Yeah. And most importantly, if you are a patron, I would be interested in why you don't want to join. Oh, nice to see you, Inge. I would be interested in why you don't want to join as a caller. If it's because you're shy, then that's very sad. I've not watched the last couple of patrons calling. Can you give a quick overview of what's been discussed before? Quite a lot of things, actually. Feels like mostly future plans for the gameplay, and yeah, some pretty tough issues like time scaling. A lot of questions of the type, will this be possible? Will this be possible? Yeah, it's hard to give an overview just because of so much that was asked. You can check out the blog post about the previous one. I don't remember how good of a job I did of summarizing the topics, but I think I at least somewhat did it. But don't be afraid to ask the same things again, because different people always have a slightly different background, even if they ask the same question. So anything that you might be interested in can be interesting. Thank you. That is good to hear that the sound is very clear for me. Also, I wrote it at the top of the chat later on, maybe like 30 minutes in or a little later. I will have a dedicated session for people in the chat, so that if we're having like a really involved discussion via audio, you get a chance to ask it as well. And for that to work properly, let me quickly try to share the chat with you, and let me know if you can see that on YouTube, because as far as I'm aware, the chat actually doesn't get recorded. So at least for the sections where I only take chat questions, I think I will go into this mode to make the chat visible on YouTube. So do you see that? All right, perfect. So starting with Inge's first question, have I finished my refactoring? Pretty much yes. I'm now in the part of the refactoring where I'm trying to make the game run again, and it almost does. And then I kind of come into this period of the refactoring where I don't have to completely rewrite everything, but I can just, whenever I find a little time, transition towards a nicer style of writing everything. Yeah, having the chat is great for you guys to see which kind of delay I'm dealing with. So seems like about 4 seconds from you to me, and then again 4 seconds back. I just noticed that Jesse joined. Let's see when we will hear his audio. Hello. Can you please say? A little
distracted.
Oh. You just joined with a super high-pitched voice, and I don't know if that was just a glitch on my end.
Possibly.
Okay. Well, nice to have you again, Jesse.
Thank you.
We just only got started.
Okay. Hi, Inge.
And yeah, so does that answer your question, Inge, about the refactoring? I'm actually really happy with how it turned out. The code becomes a lot more readable, a lot more like normal Rust, and this not only will be a great motivation boost for myself to write very complicated things much shorter, but that should also make it much more straightforward to write mods, hopefully. And actually, if I'm lucky, I applied for holding a presentation at a Rust conference. They're still in the call for papers phase, but if everything works out, I might actually do a presentation about some part of the engine of Citybound for some other fellow Rust developers, which would be super amazing. So let's see. Yeah, maybe while we're still waiting for some more people to join, Inge, do you want to call us? Do you want to tell us about what you're working on? Because I only vaguely remember something like a Sims-like simulation, but I'm not sure if that's correct. All right, and maybe for the people for whom this is the first patrons calling which they're joining, Jesse, who just joined us, has been pretty much the star of the last two patrons calling, greatly helping me out to carry the conversation and asking lots of interesting questions.
Oh, if anything, I'm the supporting actor. You're the star.
All right, so I did remember correct about Inge, that she's writing a kind of people simulator. By the way, Inge, if you ever feel like telling about it, I mean, it's kind of like much more zoomed in than Citybound, but feel free to tell about your game on the Citybound subreddit, because I think there will be tons of people interested in that as well.
Well, something weird I remember back in 2003, you could buy a copy of The Sims 1 Deluxe Edition and SimCity 4, and if you got them as a bundle, then you were able to import your Sims into SimCity.
Yeah, I remember doing that. It was actually quite cool.
Yeah, so maybe we can import Inge's people,
that would
whatever
be
she
super
ends up
sweet.
calling them, into Citybound.
The world is a stage. Nice. Yeah, okay, so I can already tell you now, Inge, that I'm definitely up for integration. All right, Jesse, do you have anything to start us with?
No,
I always ask you this.
I've done a thorough job of exhausting all of the possible conversation approaches that I would have over the past two live streams.
Makes sense. So
okay, here's something.
Okay.
With all the time you spend doing work and other projects and coding Citybound, how much time do you ever find to watch other creators in the SimCity City Skylines community?
I will take your question and make it a little more general, because I remember there was also in the like people who couldn't join text questions, what are my favorite content creators, and it kind of goes into the same direction.
Yep.
Right now, I don't watch other city building let's players that much. There used to be a time, maybe, I don't know, a little more than a year ago, where I watched a lot of, or I guess 2 years ago, SimCity Let's Players, and also some City Skyline Let's Plays. And I think the one which I liked the best is called, I think you also mentioned it, like design-centric SimCity or something like that.
Yep. Strict Toaster.
Exactly, where the person is like really finicky about all the layout and details and into how they design their cities. So they don't just work well, but actually also look nice aesthetically, which can be quite a challenge in SimCity. And I really enjoyed watching those. The other one which I remember just because I'm a huge fan of Day 9, who is usually a StarCraft caster.
Yeah.
But he also had a Let's Play on City Skylines, which was
Oh, that
pretty
was the briefest
random.
thing. Yeah.
It was pretty random and like spammy, but in a way it was also interesting for me
Well, that's
to
how the
see
casual
someone,
player plays it.
yeah, exactly, how someone like that would play it. And then apart from that, it feels like random snippets, but I didn't really watch any Let's Player to great lengths. As
Okay.
to maybe the second aspect, which I tried to bring into this question, what I tend to watch the most lately is actually homegrown educational videos on YouTube, mostly on physics or mathematics or stuff like
Mhm.
that. I'm a
So
big fan
something
of,
like minute physics.
yeah, exactly, minute physics, um, like number file, these kinds of things. One that
Veritasium.
exactly, one that I really liked about mathematics, it's called something like 3 blue 5 brown or something like that,
Uh-huh.
who does more in-depth videos which are like up to 20 minutes long with really amazing visualizations, and it just blows and all the education in maths I had, even in my computer science studies, out of the water in terms of understandability. So yeah, this is something that I really admire. All right, let's have a look at chat. I think we can get started with some more serious stuff.
Yep. And so what do you not like about other city games? Is something Inga's asking.
I could probably talk for a long time about that.
Top 5.
Okay. Starting with older games, I think we talked about it last time. SimCity always seemed rightfully the gold standard for city building games, but it always felt really difficult for me, especially the budgeting part, where I felt that no matter how much thought I put into all kinds of aspects of the city, making sure that everyone is happy and well infrastructure, the cities didn't really get going, or I ended up in way too much debt until the day, and apparently at least you also share this experience, you discovered a tutorial about budgeting where it basically tells you forget about all of the needs. You don't actually need a school for a really long time, and these people will be happy even without a hospital. Well, they won't be happy, but they will stay and you will earn a lot of money so you can expand your city. And this was at the same time kind of an aha moment, but also disappointment, because I don't really think that that's how real cities work. Like, you need to have some base level of infrastructure for people to even want to come there. And this
Well,
balance just seemed to be a little off. Yeah.
well, to an extent, that is absolutely true because that tutorial makes you grow a city to about 20,000 people before you get the school or the hospital or whatever.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
you
sure.
find in most places a town with fewer than 20,000 people doesn't have a school or a hospital, that they'll
Yeah,
go to a nearby town.
yeah, exactly. Picking up there what we discussed last time, and I think it's good that we bring it up again because I think there's lots of new people here today. The point is exactly that's correct, of course, but then in real life you would have a bigger city nearby where you go to school or go to hospital instead. And in SimCity, at least if you start off, you're kind of very isolated, so people just don't have a school, which is kind of weird.
Mm.
Um, con Continuing from there, and continuing to the newer games, I absolutely love the promise of agent-based simulation, as should be no news to anyone somewhat following Citybound. But I was very disappointed by how little SimCity delivered in this regard, even
Mm.
considering how much they promised up until the latest moment. Like, I really followed their development blogs with a lot of interest, and it really did seem to do
Absolutely.
all of that.
Yeah.
And then, like, upon launch, we found out that, okay, it's kind of all in there, but cities are just tiny. Where I remember after playing it for the first time, I came back to the website with the dev blog, I think, and on top you can see this like screenshot, like crop of a screenshot, and it looks like, wow, this is like the center of a really huge city spanning like several blocks. But then after playing the game, you realize that this picture is actually the biggest crop you could get out of a screenshot of a whole city, and right after the crop ends, the city ends. And I think this summarizes in a great way how disappointed I really was by the size of the city. But then I was like, oh well, I have to see it more like an experiment. It's like the first step towards agent simulation, and at least they're really detailed, right? I can see every little car, only to find out slightly later that, wait a second, like they don't even have persistent homes or jobs, and they're not just superficially, but actually also inside the engine, not that
I
different
feel like
from the,
SimCity
yeah,
ended up with the worst of both worlds when it came to the agent simulation, because you didn't get any benefit out of the
yeah,
transport system or the people by making them agent based.
yeah,
But they made all the power and water and garbage agent based, and that just made your whole system harder to make. And it meant that
yeah,
once you fixed it, it took a while for it to influence the rest of the city.
exactly.
So it
And
was the worst of both worlds.
yeah, exactly. So I think with this, I covered the two most obvious points. And then one of the side effects of this focus on agent-based simulation, even though it was bad, was that suddenly it felt like the game was very strongly about transport infrastructure, whereas pretty much every aspect of the game was more or less simple to handle. But the biggest problem which you would constantly be trying to solve is traffic jams. And also, like, all the discussion around the games in the communities was mostly about build road systems which have a high enough bandwidth to even support any city properly. I think City Skylines, and to be honest, I never played it myself, which is kind of a crime. I only watched Let's Plays. I think it did a great job in both the two biggest problems, the city size and the believability of the agents. Whereas, as far as I understand, they do have a persistent home and a persistent job, which,
Absolutely, yeah, they do. The big shortcut they took was in deleting or teleporting people to their destination if your traffic was
yeah,
too bad.
and that's kind of a hack that I can almost accept, because it, like, you put a lot of
It
constraints
forgives
on
you.
the system by, like, making time pass so fast, but you still want to see cars go and not just zip by. So this is kind of a way to hide the most ugly artifacts that you get from that. What actually upsets me a lot more is pocket cars. So for the people who are not familiar with the term, the thing that happens if someone goes by car to the train station and then takes a train, and then the last bit to work from the train,
Yeah,
at the
yeah.
train station, they magically transform into a car or pull a car out of their pocket, I guess, to go the rest to work. And this kind of, for me, negates the whole point of even having trains and even having different kinds of transport. Where I feel like simulating a lot less on just the statistical level, having trains seemed more believable in, like, the old SimCities, for example. Um, I will try to bring in a couple other aspects, because these are all really obvious, I feel. Or one big other topic, which we also discussed in the previous Patrons Calling, is that I'm disappointed with pretty much all city building games regarding the level of feedback that they give you. They all have different kinds of information maps, graphs over time, but it's usually really hard to understand what exactly the consequences of your actions are. And it's even harder to understand why something that you want to happen is not happening. So yeah, formulated the other way around, this is one of my main goals for Citybound, and my hypothesis is that by having a really detailed and sound agent-based simulation, I can actually gather a lot more useful information for the player from that, and show, like, cause-effect relationships or what's missing in a way much more directly. I will just quickly try to catch up with all of the comments in chat. Yeah, also talking about the teleporting. Okay, Dimitri says one thing, the one thing that he loved about SimCity 5 is that the water pipes were built into the roads, which is a detail that I don't see mentioned a lot, but I actually also loved it for two reasons. Because that's actually how it works in real life, as I'm aware of, that usually you have like the big
Yeah.
pipes going along the road.
Unless you have a pipeline, it runs under the road. Exactly, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And it kind of got rid of the whole annoying micromanagement of water pipes, which I never really understood what the purpose for that is, other than to kind of teach the player, look, a city needs water and it needs to like be a good infrastructure.
Well,
yeah.
I could propose another system which would replace water pipes, which would be hyper hard mode for people, is managing sewage systems or managing gravity-fed water systems. So you then have to take into account the height of the lands that it all gravity feeds down at one end.
And I think SimCity, all the way to the old versions, actually did some form of gravity-based water management, which was interesting.
I thought it was just like a range of effect around water towers.
Okay, yeah, I mean, the way I interpreted that was that, yeah, because of gravity, this water tower can reach that far. I don't know if it actually was smart enough that if you build it on a hill, it can reach farther or something like that.
No, it wasn't.
But okay, I definitely see the possibility to go super detailed there.
Now, you mentioned before that you find city sim games don't provide you enough information to deal with your problems.
Yeah.
Yeah, so SimCity 4 is the gold standard of everything. What data didn't you get from SimCity 4 that you wanted?
Probably, I will start with this. Probably the most helpful metric was land attractivity, to kind of predict growth for all three of RCI.
Okay. I always got that information as kind of a combination of the land value and the desirability charts.
Exactly. So what I would want more there is to actually have that split up into land value, which for me is not even that important, and the desirability and exactly which factors contribute to that desirability, because this would show you exactly what is missing. And this would have been pretty easy to do, I think, in their statistical model, because you could just show the inputs into that value. I mean, it's probably a design choice, and it's always a design choice to think about which information you want to hide from the player because you don't really have access to it as a real city planner. But my assumption is there that the intuition of real city planners is much more complicated than this kind of very far reduced attractivity of land, where they can take into account all kinds of factors that play a part for desirability. So this would be one of the most obvious things which I would want to do. And it fits in very nicely into like the needs system for individual actors, and the system which the actors need anyways for location choice, where they do exactly this evaluation of, okay, how far is the closest park to here? How likely will I be to be able to take part in cultural events? Is there a school close for the children, which I maybe don't even have yet? And so on and so forth. Let me again look at the chat. Yeah, like I promised earlier, maybe in like 5 to 10 minutes, I will give chat a chance to dedicatedly ask me questions. Until then, what I really don't like about any other city building games, which also explains why this is an important feature that I've been promising from the very beginning for Citybound, is that all of the buildings look the same. And even though that is the case in some parts of some cities in real life, it's very obvious to me that like there's just a very limited selection of assets yet alone procedural architecture, which for me feels like it's almost like an uncanny valley for cities.
Absolutely.
Where I don't know if everyone is familiar with this term. Usually the uncanny valley refers to like 3D characters in video games, where like as they became increasingly realistic, first they become more lifelike, and you still understand that they're more like comic characters, so you can still relate to them even though they don't perfectly look realistic. And then I would say with current generation games, we have perfectly realistic looking characters, and they are so convincing that you can also believe in them. But in between, there's the so-called uncanny valley where the characters look kind of realistic, but not realistic enough, and kind of cartoony, but not cartoony enough, and they just end up looking super creepy. We still have the somewhat with realistic characters where they look photorealistic, but their animations are creepy or not really human-like. And which just goes to show that even if you try really hard to make something look realistic, there's like we are so sensitive to tiny details that can just completely throw us off and kind of kick us out of believing that what we see is real for the sake of fun. And this happens to me with city building games, even though I understand that it's about like the dynamics of the city and it's a simulation. And I could imagine this to be a real city, but just a small detail of constantly seeing the same buildings everywhere. That's why I really want to try to get procedural generation going.
In response to what Inga's saying that she likes the uncanny valley levels of realism, really? Like, it's uncanny for a reason. That either side of the uncanny valley is fine, and being just unrealistic enough that it's not uncanny is fine, but the uncanny valley is, as it suggests, uncanny. I also agree with Dimitri that, I mean, I'd be just happy with square buildings or buildings made out of blocks or simple gables. For 99% of the development of Citybound, I am not overly fussed with detailed architectural styles, because as soon as you start to devote your time to that, that's a wide uncanny valley that you have to bridge between simple plain boxes and fully detailed buildings, and anywhere in the middle will make it just look like a crummy indie game. Where you put in a little bit of effort but not enough.
Like before it almost, and I got this compliment about early prototypes, it looks like this minimalistic, as if I did it on purpose style, which can be nice in of itself. And yeah, then you need to spend a lot of time on details before you reach the other side of the uncanny valley of realism. The kind of thing or the kind of strategy that I have about graphics in general is, since all graphics will be procedural, I want to start from the zoomed out level, where if you look at the whole city, kind of the structures which you see should look realistic, like a satellite image. And like boxy buildings or buildings with simple gables might well be enough to get the realistic structure, the realistic skyline from a far distance.
Yeah.
And then as I invest more and more resources, I kind of try to add the details to get to the next zoom level.
Well, at that point, probably the next step would be sticking with the white, but simply adding different forms of buildings. Like, I know, a barn on a farmyard, or a more interesting office building for the city center, or something like that. And keeping it as plain white as long as you can while building up the details will keep it looking fun. People slowly notice more detail added to the buildings over time, and once they're fully formed with their meshes, that's when you could start introducing textures.
Exactly. And maybe, again, to use a comparison to 3D characters, I really love a blog post from Valve, or the developers of Team Fortress 2, where they describe how they designed the look of the different character classes in Team Fortress, where they actually started from the silhouettes of the characters and tried to make them as distinguishable as possible, and to really make their shape about their function. And then slowly like they added color to help with that, and only then they added like subtle details and subtle texture to end up with a cartoony but detailed character. And I want to try to apply the same to buildings, that I really start with silhouettes only, which is exactly blocks and roof shapes and something like that. Get the effect of as diverse looking buildings as possible that speak a very clear language about their function. Like this is an apartment block, this is an old town historical building, this is a factory. And then once put in this way, then I can start investing time on adding details. But it's not a priority. Never mind the doorbell. Let me see what people have been saying. All right. Seems like people are mostly discussing the looks. Make it either realistic looking or functional looking. I think there's actually something in between where you get the best of both worlds, which is exactly for characters, I guess, Team Fortress style characters, or for buildings. What I've been saying again and again is that I wanted to look like Mirror's Edge, which looks realistic but has a very reduced selection of colors, and even a reduced set of shapes that reappear, which strikes a great balance, if you ask me.
Well, here's an idea.
Yeah, let's hear your idea, and then I will give the people in chat a chance.
Yeah, sorry.
No problem.
So most of the Mirror's Edge buildings are mostly plain white anyway.
Yeah.
And say you have a tiny little house and it's a white or slightly off-white, slightly gray overall color with shading on it. Yeah. If the windows are still solid, it looks like it's a model paper house. So to make the house look real, you would need the windows to be a dark gray or a blue or a reflection or something like that.
Yeah, sure.
If you scale that up to an office building or like a huge skyscraper with curtain glass windows, then the whole thing is glass. And it still looks like a normal part of the city because all the glass in the city is textured. And that's the only texture on the buildings. And you throw on top of that, say, textures for your scaffolding on the building under construction, bright orange, and you throw on the colors for a bright billboard on the top of the building, and that's pretty much exactly what the Mirror's Edge look is. Exactly, it was all white with these flashes of color across the city.
So I think you described it exactly in the right way and in which I want to pursue that like I will try to come up with maybe the minimal selection of reusable materials, not necessarily textures. Plain white wall, reflective glass, maybe tiled roofs and a couple other things, and with that you can do 99% of what you need in a city, and at the same time you really get a nice and consistent look across buildings. All right, so let's take a couple minutes to let people in the chat ask whatever they want. I will put the chat on the screen again. And right, you should be able to see the chat now. And you will notice some lag. I will try to go through the chat and see if I missed anything. Okay, underground power lines. Yeah, underground power lines is a detail that always, there's a lot of different aspects that always confused me about SimCity as a child because I'm not from America. And we only have long distance power lines on top of ground. Everything else is underground. We don't really have these kind of water towers at all, and lots of other small details.
I'd almost prefer to have overground power lines because it just adds an extra detail to the roads. Like the classic little pine tree with power lines running across the top. And I guess you could upgrade the road later down the line to have underground power lines to make it look cleaner for a cost, because underground power lines do cost more. But that would add more detail to the top of the roads, and it would carry the power along the roads. Because one of my biggest gripes with city skylines is that the power line looks like it's a high voltage, long distance power line, but it's so minuscule.
Yeah.
It's the size of a little wooden pole model. So in my game, I went and got a model to replace the original with a wooden pole model.
So it looks more
so I can drag the roadside power lines and then I had to find a huge tower for my long distance ones, which is just a prop.
Yeah. Yeah, and this is maybe a good example of how cities of different sizes can be different, and even of how cities in different countries can look different just because of small details like that.
Mm.
In Russia, where I lived for a while, in St. Petersburg, they have just wires across the street, particularly like for old buildings, like a spider web. Whereas in other parts of the same town, even, it's underground and not like that. But yeah, this is a nice detail. So Hybrid Gamer asked about the road layout and traffic. The road layout will be quite complex. If you look at the traffic prototype or the videos which I made about that, you can manipulate individual lanes, create pretty much any kind of complicated intersection, roundabout, highway interchange that you want. And cars behave realistically on that, not just on a like high level that there will be lots of cars when it's rush hour. This is just an organic side effect of the agent-based simulation where people actually want to go to work and go shopping and so on. But even on a micro level, the cars slow down for each other, try to overtake realistically, and this should help to get all of these kinds of interesting chaotic effects where a small detail like an intersection light that's timed not quite optimally might create a huge backlog of cars. What I'm trying to achieve there. Martin Johansson is saying about buildings with irregular shapes that can sprawl around the more pre-industrial street network. Make it possible for us Europeans to build a medieval city core as the cities that we live in. We talked about this in one of the previous streams as well. And I also talked about it with my top funding patron, where I think what I want to go for is that it can just be part of the map generation that there's a historic city core. Because what doesn't really happen is that you like build a fake Disneyland historic core. I don't know, maybe in some places it does, but here usually not. But I want Citybound to be set in modern times, so a historic city core is something that you start part of an existing structure. But I want to make it a fully functional part of the game where people can actually live there and shops can be there, and it can even have a touristic value attached to it, which...
And I guess if you had a map editor, then people could create that city core the way they wanted to.
Yeah, probably. Like for a long time, I will try to do everything with procedural generation where you can adjust the parameters. But I know that it's really important for people to recreate either existing cities or to micromanage some kind of invented city. So I guess at some point there will be a map editor where you can manually place stuff. So, dear people in the chat, any other questions that you have? Yeah, fake historic districts happen. What about trees? I'm from an area with really dense forests, and I like how they look like almost a solid shape from above. In city skylines, yeah, it's a frame killer.
Well, the trouble with every tree has thousands of polygons because you need to make it look like it's a tree with leaves rather than a blob.
Yeah, so let me just say that beautiful looking nature in video games is something that's for some reason really close to my heart, and I spent unbelievable amounts of hours as a child playing around with the CryEngine, pretty much just trying to make realistic looking far-reaching natural environments with lots of forests. And by doing this, I actually learned a lot about the kind of 3D rendering and techniques behind it, also how the trees are modeled to like get the most bang for the lowest amount of polygons and so on. I think, and I have some rough ideas for that, I think for games like city building games where you mostly look at the trees from above, you can even get away with some cheaper rendering techniques which work the way that grass is usually rendered in like first-person shooter games. And it's not exactly the same because trees are in a way more volumetric than grass. And I've been thinking about maybe even doing some kind of volumetric rendering where trees are more like, and especially a forest is more like a connected dense cloud of leaves, where there's again techniques for rendering that efficiently. And I think I want to experiment with that a little bit when I have time for that, because it would be really cool to have huge, expansive forests that don't rely on like traditional, stupid, let's copy paste this tree model 1,000 times kind of techniques, but do something smarter. Yeah, that's my 5 cents about that. Donald Jenkins is curious about the details for citizens. I assume with that you mean their lives, like what is actually simulated for them.
That's up to you.
What do you mean?
Replying to Donald Jenkins, the details of their lives, that's up to you.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, helping me out with the marketing pitch there. So the short version is that I'm modeling both material as well as sources for every single person and every family, as well as every business. They're not absolute exact values like this family has this much money and this much food and this much happiness or whatever, but they're kind of more dynamic, rough approximations. So this family is doing quite okay on money. They're doing not that well on education because like the school is far away and it takes a long time to get there or whatever, or maybe they might do good on education, but going there takes so long that they don't have time to go to the park. And because of that, they're doing bad on like or something like this. This is how you can imagine. So it's quite diverse resources which are kept track of per person, but they work pretty simple, and it's really easy to define the interactions of people with companies or places that will manipulate their resources. So it should be possible to do that on a scale of millions of citizens and have all the kinds of networking effects and aggregate behavior because of people with similar fates, for example. I hope that answers your question on a high level.
Well, he asked, about the lifestyle of the citizens, which you answered, but also the graphics of what the citizens might look like. And with that, I kind of almost have a request for what they look like. So have you ever seen architectural models where the people in the models are simply white, like almost silhouettes?
Yeah.
Yeah, I am quite strongly of the opinion that even in a finished game where buildings look photorealistic and landscapes look incredible, that you should like almost keep the people as white models always, all the way through the game. Because I don't think you would ever render them to look like real people, like properly real people, at that tiny scale. And if you did, that would just be really creepy. Like to have photos of people in your city.
Definitely not.
And there's something really cute about having these representations of people, like almost phantom people, that they're just filling up a little paper city that you're creating as a little model.
Yeah, that brings us back actually to the Uncanny Valley question again. And what you just described exists in SimCity, in the new SimCity, if you turn on the, what was it, I think, where you can see which people go where, like people going to work, shoppers, where they just become these little one-colored figures. And I agree that looked really, really cool. And this is definitely what people will look like in the beginning. However, from the standpoint of wanting to not just simulate individual people, but kind of showcasing their diversity, I think I want to have at least randomized colors for, like, let's say, pants, shirt, and skin, so that if you have a bunch of people, they actually look like 10 different people and not 10 like chess figures which have the same color. Okay. Most importantly, so like not necessarily to achieve the fact that one person looks believable, although that would be nice, but they will stay pretty simple shapes. So if you zoom in, it will look more like a chess figure, I guess. But the most important effect which I want to achieve, which brings me back to what I described initially for like the different zoom levels and making sure that structures look realistic from far away. And also connecting that again with Roller Coaster Tycoon, the effect which I want to achieve is that a crowd looks like a crowd. And a crowd looks like a crowd not because everyone looks the same, but because there's this colorful mess of different people. So that's why actually both for pedestrians as well as for cars, I want to go with very diverse looking ones. And like you can get the very first approximation of this feeling again from the traffic prototypes, where cars are all cuboids, but they have random colors. And I tested it. It looks like much more cars if they all have different colors than if they have the same color. And like just psychologically, you understand that this car is an individual, even though it's one in a mass of a lot of other cars.
Well,
so
I would argue as a counterpoint to having everyone be very colorful and being very different to simply modeling slightly different shapes of pants or skirts or hats or whatever. And that, say, you focused attentions on animating the characters a heap rather than bringing out colors and looks, that if they're capable of sitting on a park bench and relaxing or feeding the pigeons or doing yoga in the park or running down the street or whatever, that individuality of an individual creates that crowd of people you're talking about. So that way they're not all the same shape person moving at the same speed through a crowd.
Yeah, and this goes back to the like functionality of people's silhouette, where hopefully already with like some very simple animation states for the people, I can achieve the even more important effect than making people look diverse, which is making their activities which they're doing right now diverse, which you just described.
Which I think is another reason why Roller Coaster Tycoon crowds look so great, because everyone walks at a slightly different speed. So even if you have 1,000 people in one spot, they spread out at a different rate and end up creating a cloud of people.
Yeah, that's a great point. Okay, going through further questions. Have you considered merging an underground train network with an above the ground network? Yes.
That was
of
one of
course. Why not?
SimCity 4's most abstract limits. That you had the overground train and you had the subway, and they could connect, but neither of them could connect to the on-ground heavy rail.
Yeah, I think I don't know how exactly it works. I've been to enough different cities to have seen all kinds of weird intermediate states between light rail, like trams, and heavy rail, like full trains. The weirdest of which I think has been Stuttgart in Germany, where they have a subway which is also above ground and which in some parts of the city also works like a tram, but then in some parts also just goes across fields like a heavy train. So I think what I want to do is just to distinguish between heavy rails and light rails, where you can have the light rails on roads and on ground, above ground, underground, and you can have the heavy rails, I guess, also on ground, above ground, below ground, only just not on roads, even though I think even that exists somewhere in real cities. Yeah. But I think it makes
people can customize or mod whatever vehicles they want for the light rail and the heavy rail, whether they're trams or whether they're proper light rail or whatever.
So I think in terms of gameplay, the most important properties of the two are cost of building it, and I think with light rail you can have a much higher curve radius, exactly because you want to use it inside of a city.
By high, you mean smaller?
Yeah.
Yeah, and then you could probably have a third state, which would be high-speed rail, which would have a much wider curve radius and almost couldn't change elevation at all, and you could almost cross that with like your Hyperloop or your monorail, whatever it is.
Yeah.
Okay, here's a question from Inga.
Okay.
Are we almost there yet?
Can we have ice cream? I decided for myself to not give any estimates about anything so far, because all the promises where I gave an explicit time frame, I've been off by roughly an order of magnitude. I tend to think about Citybound now as an like ongoing research project with the goal of producing playable, fun gameplay. The problem which you might be aware of, is that something like Citybound has never been done before by anyone, even researchers. So it's completely new, not just for you, but also for me, with me having the slight additional difficulty of having to figure out how to actually do it. So I do spend a lot of time building the tools and building the technology that it requires. It also doesn't help that I have really crazy ambitions, but for me, it's the kind of deal where if I won't be able to achieve that, I don't really see a point in doing just like a slightly better city building game. I really want something revolutionary in several different aspects. And for that, I want to make sure that I actually build the technology that makes that possible. I'm now at the point where I still have a lot of work to do, but I kind of proved to myself that the most scary parts are doable and that I can build the technology.
Mm.
I don't
Well,
know how, yeah.
In what state is the economic model currently? And I know that about a month ago, it was almost at a point where it could somewhat function with a tiny miniature city.
Yeah, so the abstract aspects of it, that families and businesses have resources and that in general they try to find the best place for a resource and try to get there during their day, are written down in code. And like I couldn't try it out yet because it's not integrated with the existing game yet, which is, I kind of had to make a decision there. Do I want to abstractly write some tests for the economy where I by hand manually build up like some businesses and some families and see if reasonable stuff happens by like logging the events to my console output and reading text? But I decided to move a little faster in some way and immediately integrate it with the existing game world. So actual buildings pop up next to the roads, which we already have, and people actually go by car to the places to get their resources, just to be able to already debug it visually and see what would happen and see if people have enough time to like physically get there by car to make sure that the system works as a whole. And yeah, right now I'm working on this integration part. And then probably the next step will be fixing all the obvious big mistakes in the simple economic model and then increasing complexities of scenarios that I can do with that.
Well, with the engines that you've so far made, what sort of limits do you see for props, for buildings, for trees, for populations? Because, I mean, every game has its limits.
Okay, so let's start with cars, because that's where I can give the most concrete answer, because there is the traffic simulation and it can handle on my laptop like 400,000 cars. So this is reaching the level where I can say that, okay, probably regarding traffic, I can model 1 million cars on one computer. About the economy, my intuition is that it's kind of easier than traffic simulation. But I'm not sure what exactly the performance bottlenecks of that are. Most likely the performance bottleneck of economy will be finding stuff on the market that you need, like finding the best workplace for you, finding the best shop for a certain resource, because that always implies a global search where you have to compare maybe not all the shops, but at least all the shops in an area. Or I'm trying to get around that by having people just discover shops kind of as they go, like you would do in real life. That makes it easier, of course. But yeah, I don't have a clear intuition on the dynamics of the performance there.
Because City Skylines really starts lagging out after about 25,000 people for
Yeah,
a
but
large city. And like SimCity
maybe
4
yeah.
slows down after about 300,000 people, and that's just statistical analysis. That isn't even simulation.
Yeah, I don't know about the statistical analysis, why that's the case. I can definitely give some more insight about City Skylines, because probably every single person actually a full-blown like engine object of the Unity engine which they're using, as far as I know. And these things just carry a kind of pretty large overhead with themselves, where basically each engine object is pretty huge in some way, because the engine is written more like for first-person shooters or maybe third-person games, where at most you have 1,000 of some kind of actor. And of course, a city-building game pushes the limits there.
You want hundreds of thousands or millions of actors.
Yes, and all of the design of my technology has been to make an actor really as tiny as possible. Like a car is less than hundreds of bytes, I think, maybe a little more. So it's not only really easy to have a lot of them in memory, but it's also easy to have a lot of them in cache, which is one of the most important performance considerations nowadays. So basically, by making stuff much tinier than other game engines can, I'm able to simulate a lot more entities at once. And I'm just trying to put as much interesting properties and information of each car or each citizen into as few bytes as possible. I hope this gives some idea about that question.
Well, running the math, if every car is 100 bytes, then you can do about 10 million cars before you've filled up like 8 gigabytes worth of RAM, which is a huge amount of RAM even just for cars.
Exactly.
So realistic limits, you'd probably be looking at about 1 million cars then before you're consuming excessive amounts of RAM.
Yeah, definitely.
Because then you're already at 800 meg just for the memory required to keep track of cars.
I'm just sorry, I'm lagging because I'm trying to do the calculation in my head myself. But yeah, that sounds about right.
So if they're 100 bytes each, then 10 cars makes a kilobyte.
Yeah,
10,000 cars makes a megabyte.
Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah.
Yes, so that is probably the correct limit. But you see there is potentially servers with a lot more than 8 gigabytes. So if you can run
But you're not just simulating cars, you're simulating people, you're simulating economies. Like the individual decisions, I imagine, will be a kilobyte or two per person.
No, a person is actually also roughly in the same ballpark.
Okay.
Yeah, maybe a kilobyte per person, but definitely not more than that.
There's definitely more in a city to simulate and to store in memory than just cars and their activities.
Yes, but I always use cars and their activities as an approximation because that's the thing that you almost have the most of, except people, and that you have to update the most often, because even the decisions for people only really happen once they arrive at a place or once they start leaving from a place.
Yeah, that's a really good point, that like the cars are the most graphically responsive thing that you see.
Yeah, I actually have to update them more than 60 frames per second for the behavior to work correctly. So this is always why, and this is actually the strategic decision why after rewriting the engine in Rust, I first did the traffic simulation, because this is kind of the benchmark and everything else should be easier. Okay, I will continue with a couple questions from chat. Because Matt Thompson asked a lot of interesting questions. How would airports or harbors work? Will they have custom lanes, runways, pathing, or will they be predefined? My goal for that is that you basically zone them, and then you have procedurally generated harbors or airports within that zone. That sounds really challenging. I think I can get away with first doing something really simple, where maybe the system is smart enough to kind of plop two runways there in the terminal building where there's still space, and you just have to imagine the planes taxiing, where later either me, when I find time, or some hardcore modder can create a system that actually lays down realistic taxiways and the planes go to the terminal and so on. So
I'd like the game to really tell me like, zone out an area this big for the airport. We need it to be 2 kilometers long, 500 meters wide or whatever, and it needs to be super flat ground. And I can paint with
Yeah.
the paintbrush until it tells me I've done enough. And that should be enough room not only for my small landing strip for my small town airport, but enough room such that it could grow to a large municipal airport.
Yeah, and I think that the way to achieve that is to make it as interactive as possible, where ideally the generation is so fast that it can like show you real-time suggestions as you draw the zone. Like, look, now there would fit 3 runways like this. Even
Or,
yeah,
this runway is 500 meters long. You can land planes this big.
exactly. Yeah. How big can buildings be? Well, as big as they
As
are in
big as
real
you
life. Yeah. And of course, there's sub-basement floor levels, and maybe you will even have to keep them in mind when you build subways.
Dimitri wants to know if you've ever seen Rick and Morty because he really likes the design of the alien cities that they have.
No, I haven't. It has been recommended to me many times, but I really feel like I don't have time to watch any kind of series, even really good ones. But maybe since you're familiar with it, you want to fill me in with what the alien cities are like?
I've just Googled it now. They look pretty interesting.
I'll try to do the same. Or Dimitri, maybe you can tell me what you like about them. Okay, like I by looking at screen caps, I can't really tell what exactly is cool about it.
Yeah, it just looks a bit fantastical.
Okay. No, there's just people bragging about how much RAM they have.
Yeah.
But
And I think
yeah,
it's worth
this is
repeating that absolutely we're not trying to make a game that can run on your 5-year-old laptop. To make a simulation of millions of agents, you'd need a very powerful computer, and you're not wanting to limit the game's functionality just so that it can run on everyone's computer.
yeah. And one thing that people might not be aware of, the save games will be exactly what is stored in memory. So there's no like real transformation going on. So your save games, if you have a city of several millions of people, might actually be 32 gigabytes big. But the game itself is really tiny, so you can think about getting all the space that a AAA game would usually take up on your space, but you could have several of huge cities in there, which
So I guess
hopefully,
that'll just make sharing cities a really challenging part.
in a way, yes. Luckily, I mean, we really good internet connections tend to be more widespread. So, I mean,
It'll
people
make downloading the cities as if they were downloading a whole game.
exactly. That's the way to think about it. I will have to see how well they compress also, for example, but I think it's a price worth paying. To put it more dramatically, I wouldn't really know how to achieve that, how to achieve millions of agents without the files getting that big.
Dimitri likes about the Rick and Morty city that it's comfy and cozy. It looks like they've been built for people. There's some cars, but not too many. There are multi-level plazas, there are multi-level passageways, and there are funky building shapes from small to gigantic. Lots of different colors.
Okay, cool. So this brings together a couple aspects. I think someone earlier also asked if there will be bicycles.
Yep, bicycle
And
lanes.
I really want to move away from the like car-centric, I guess, American view of cities towards the more pedestrian, more bicycle oriented, or not moving towards there, but making it possible. and really making it possible to explore and try out pedestrian-only parts of the city. Again, because that's something really important where I come from. And maybe even experimenting with something like pedestrian-only cities, where maybe you have subway, but cars can't go there. Or you could have something like Venice, where it's really difficult for cars to get there, but you have boats and lots of tiny channels. Second aspect, which you mentioned, Dimitri, is multi-level stuff, which I really want to achieve both for roads as well as for pedestrian things, because real cities can be surprisingly three-dimensional, not just with buildings, but actually with the network of transport infrastructure. Probably the craziest city which I've seen in this regard was Genoa in Italy, which is built like kind of onto a cliff next to the ocean, and you have parts of the cities on completely different levels, like literally levels where there's a huge step in the landscape. And they actually have this funny thing where a building at the edge of such a cliff has one address at its bottom where it has a normal entrance, but then it also has a roof entrance which is connected to the higher level of another part of the city. And this is kind of like the holy grail. If I achieve to do stuff like that, then I think cities in Citybound will be three-dimensional enough. Okay, so I think I will switch back and keep an eye on the chat. But during all of this discussion, were there any bigger points that you wanted to ask
Ingus
about this?
suggested a potential compromise if you wanted to handicap the game in any way, that to simplify agents, because I agree that probably the single most complex component of the simulation is going to be individual agent choices regarding like household decisions and lifetime choices and stuff. If you wanted to simplify that system, you could let the player pick out, say, 16 people out of the city that they specifically want to follow, and then you make sure that they remain fully simulated all the time, and you can just approximate the rest of the city.
Yeah, this brings me to my least favorite topic, which is just something that feels really hard to get across for me. Maybe just because people are so used to statistical models and approximations in city building games, where you can't really have agent-based everything and an approximation. And, or to put it another way, it feels more complicated for me to write correct transitions, if it's possible at all, from a agent-based city to an approximation, and then back from an approximation to detailed agents. Like, yeah, of course, I can keep like a small selection of representative agents which the player is interested in, but all of the chaotic network effects and aggregate behaviors of a city depend on and arise from the individual actions. And I think if I try to abstract upwards at some points in the game and then add detail again, just everything would break to the point where I'm not even sure what happens anymore. And I can't say with any confidence at all that I have any, not just realistic, but reasonable model of what happens in a city. So this is why I take the extreme stance of saying, no, I want to do everything from first principles, and I want to do everything emerging from individual interactions. But that just means that I always have to keep the individuals alive at every point in time, and that there is only the individuals. I hope I managed to put this clearly.
You should save that sample and just play it at the start of the next talk.
Yeah, just I have it ready. Chokma asked, do you have a concept for the 1.0 version fixed? I feel like I have a rough idea of the level of detail that I want all the different systems to have to call it a version 1.0. Like, it should definitely have different modes of transport. I would say cars, pedestrian, buses, rail. It should have, of course, zoning and economy. that supports medium-sized to large, potentially cities. Maybe not with all of the diversity and detail that you would see in a large city. Like maybe a large city in version 1.0 might look more like a big village where you don't have something yet like an opera house.
Would you
But
say
the
that it should
systems, yeah,
have the range of content that SimCity 4 offers? So you should be able to at least do school, hospital, police, fire, and parks.
yeah, that's a good description. Mm. Yeah, I hope this gives a good impression. And technology-wise, for version 1.0, I would like to already have collaborative multiplayer across computers in a LAN. Sounds crazy,
Did
but
you ever play SimCity 2000 Network Edition?
no,
Have you ever heard of SimCity 2000 Network Edition?
yes. But I heard of it because I accidentally discovered it while playing with it as a child. But
You found it while playing with it as a child?
I think so, like an alternative executable that was included or something like that.
Okay. It is just about the rarest game Maxis has ever made.
Yeah, no, I remember seeing it definitely, but it was exactly at a time where we still had horribly expensive dial-up, and the
Ah, yeah.
internet seemed to be more something like a phone call. So I couldn't even
Because
dream
I
of
feel
buying it.
like SimCity 2000 Network Edition explored just about the only possible avenue for multiplayer city sims.
Mhm.
That the only alternative is two players just kind of build cities near each other, which is what the
Yeah,
new
what we have.
SimCity did, and that was abysmal failure.
Yeah,
So I thought it was smart from City Skylines to ignore multiplayer altogether and just do an individual city experience.
yeah, and what I'm trying to do is to do an individual city experience, but for several people. And so this just comes as a nice side effect from the way I write the technology, that it's like scalable across machines. So you should be able to have several people looking and interacting with the same city. But I will not try to polish the gameplay for that immediately. Just something very
Yeah.
basic. Just to show, hey, it's possible, again, to have one of the parts to really set Citybound apart as a concept.
Yeah. Oh, I think you've already got a half dozen premises that set Citybound apart as a concept.
Yes, but it feels like most of them are very understandable for maybe hardcore fans, like, who it's really a complicated, detailed simulation. Oh, I can really build really complicated roads, like, wow, buildings look similar. But for the average city building person, I think that's not that clear. Whereas just saying, look, you and your friend together can work on the same city, that's something really crazy and new.
Yeah, well, for the hardcore City Sim fans, they'll see all of the different technologies that you're implementing and they'll understand those benefits. But I still think it will be clear to other people how, having procedural buildings and individual lane manipulation for traffic and individual lane manipulation, say, for rail and procedural everything, how not only those features make the city look better, but the ramifications of those features creates
Yeah,
countless new features that become achievable in a city, like slip
yeah,
lanes on intersections and detail like multi-lane turning at intersections or buildings that abut each other or individual yards for properties that actually fill out the space. Like the ramifications of these features make Citybound look like no other city sim game ever.
okay, that's great to hear that you're very
Just on their
optimistic
own.
on this front.
What,
I
it's
think
what
that's
keeps me
just
sleeping.
yeah, no, and I agree, because I'm also like that. But this is maybe the most the biggest concern from people who I asked about their opinion of like how I'm doing things. Just like, okay, that all sounds really cool and innovative, but will people really understand the difference? And my answer has always been like, yeah, if they interact with it, I hope. But
Well,
yeah,
even if they don't understand the difference on paper on how it makes a difference, they should hopefully see the difference in the results.
yeah, exactly. Okay, people mentioning Let's Have Wars. You can make a mod if you want. I found it interesting that in SimCity 2000 you actually had these military bases, and they tried to kind of add a little commentary with that, I think, where
Did they?
I
Was that a part of Network Edition? I don't remember that.
no, not of Network Edition, just of the
Oh,
plain version.
okay.
Uh, and I think it was kind of hidden, like it was this weird brown zone, and you needed to have lots of industry and also education, and then it would
I never
start
found
building
the
stuff.
military.
And they would build like hangars and military airports, and I think
Oh,
the end
wow.
state for it would even be like a rocket silo. And they give you a shit ton of money in taxes, but it had some like really negative effect. I forgot what it was, but something where it felt like the game told you this is morally wrong that you allowed this in your city, which I always found kind of amusing.
Yeah. Now, Dimitri makes a very good point. Like, even just playing multiplayer through Factorio, it's really, really hard to do this sort of a game with multiple people. Because even if you find an interface that lets them work on it at the same time, people build very differently from each other and have a very different view on how it should come about. So, best case scenario, it ends up looking like a tapestry of different people's work on a city. Worst case scenario, you run into active conflict with the person you're playing with about how it should be done.
Fair enough. 2 points about that. I think Factory is much more a hardcore micromanagement game than Citybond will ever be, hopefully.
Yeah, in
So
Factorio, there is a right way and a wrong way to do things.
yeah, and I think what inspired me to even think about this possibility for Citybond, not just because it should be possible technology-wise, but because of my good experience of playing Minecraft together online with friends of me, and my bad experience of playing it online just with random strangers, or let's say more like interesting experience, where you have these public servers where everything looks like you have some really impressive parts, and then there's some part which just look like abandoned wastelands, and other parts that look like a huge war rage there. And you can definitely see that people have very different ideas of what should be where, and like fight each other and even break their stuff. But if you can control the people who you play with, you can really build some cool big projects that you couldn't build alone. And it's a hell of a lot of fun. And my intuition is that city building fans, just from looking at my lovely community, that they're much friendlier people who really like to share, for example, mods and assets. And I could really imagine that it would be super cool to maybe form some tiny sub-communities who regularly play together, and to maybe even role play managing a city together as several people. It feels as if that should be
Well, here's an
possible.
idea. Have
Yeah,
you ever heard of a small game called Artemis?
no.
No, most people haven't. It's essentially like you download a license to the game to get multiple copies, and you distribute it to all your friends, and you play it at a LAN party. And essentially, you and your mates, like 5 of them, you're like the crew of the Starship Enterprise.
Oh, okay.
So you have your captain, your navigator, your pilot, your weapons person, your engineer, and the information provided to each player's computer is exclusive to that role.
Wow, nice.
So only the navigator is getting the star map, only the pilot is getting the controls to power up and down the ship.
Mm-hmm.
And so you actually have to communicate and work together as a crew to go and achieve different things.
Mm-hmm.
It's like the captain will get snippets of all of the different stuff so they can perceive everything, but they can't actually control anything. And so it's a combination of communication, teamwork, teamwork to fix your problems and get through it all.
I just feel like,
And Inga says
yeah,
that's really boring.
there's just like this one part of my head that's listening to him, like, wow, that's so interesting. Like the social interaction between the people, like that must be so cool, especially with friends. And like other part of my brain reading the chat, like, oh, that sounds like, sure, I guess people have different tastes.
Yeah, the two times I've done it with friends, it was really engaging, really,
Cool.
really
Yeah.
fun. Because, someone screws up and your ship explodes, you know who to
Yeah.
blame.
Yeah. Exactly.
And so I'm thinking, like, you might be able to do something like that for Citybound, where you have like a transport minister or a couple of transport ministers, because that'll be the biggest job, and like a
And
ordinances person and an education person.
you actually also have asymmetric information.
Yeah, and so certain controls and information are only given to certain people, and they have to work together to create a cohesive city.
Yeah, that would be really cool. And my strategy there would be to, in the beginning, make kind of every player completely powerful and omniscient, because
Mm.
just based on my experience, people really like role playing, and they could naturally like form these responsibilities and even limit themselves to only do certain things in certain roles.
Yeah,
And then
I
based
feel.
on that, like there could be a dedicated UI that enforces some of the most popular rules.
Mm. And Inge's saying like you'd have to be on at the same time. Most people would never carry off a team like that. And I would say, well, this is multiplayer we're talking about here. It's not the focus of the game. And unless you have a SimCity 2000 Network Edition system where you're competing for land and services and basically building rival cities next to each other, it's just about the only system that might actually work and create a viable gameplay. And in that way, forward to getting together and doing kind of like Dungeons and Dragons. So it would be a
Yeah,
hard commitment for a long time with a group of really close friends.
maybe. My hope is that first it can be more asynchronous, especially if you bring like cloud servers into play, where the city actually mostly runs on a cloud server and you just connect with your clients to look at it and interact with it. And I mean, something that I often did with some city games, and even more with A-Train, for anyone who knows that, like the really old one, is actually like when I had to go somewhere, I just left the computer running and came back, and usually like the city wasn't gone in flames, but developed a little further. And I I think if I manage to make that possible, where you can kind of trust the running simulation that not everything goes horribly wrong if you stop interacting with it, then you can also have asynchronous multiplayer where like, okay, you have some time now, you kind of log in, add some stuff. Later your friend comes online, sees that you like added the plan for a new highway or whatever, he can continue with it. I think if that's possible, it makes it much more likely that people will actually find the time to collaborate on a city.
Mm.
Chokma is shocked because I used the word cloud. Relax, it's just I don't know. It could be. I always like the saying cloud just means someone else's computer, so don't worry too much about it.
Yeah. Truckman was also asking before about modding, like to what extent can you mod? How easy will it be to mod? And I replied with what I think your answer would be, that you're wanting to make everything easily moddable,
Yeah.
easily to the extent that it could just be a text input.
Yes. So several aspects, and this is a huge topic and it's an important topic. I've been discussing a lot of technical details with some smart people, contributors on GitHub, of how to do mods. And I think lately I've stubbornly come back to what I want to try, whereas there isn't really a mod API at all, but rather the whole game is open source like it is now. And every mod is a fork of the whole source code with some modifications, because that's what a mod is. Hello, Joey. Nice to have you again. Let me just quickly finish about modding. So every mod would be a complete fork of the whole code base, and which would mean that you can literally do anything you want in a mod, and you can change all the systems in the game and whatever, which sounds really chaotic. But I think version control gives you really nice ways of doing stuff like, hey, here are these different mods. Please please create a combined mod of all three of these, and ideally, if the mods are written in a clean way, the version control system can already tell you that on a source code level, these mods are compatible, merges them together, builds a new executable of the game which represents this combination of mods, and it works. This would be the ideal case. As of approachability and modding language, right now everything is written in Rust. The idea is that things that need to be the most adjustable, that need to be reconfigured the most, like simulation parameters, for example, recipes for building architecture, presets for roads, all these kinds of things would be to, even for myself, pull them out of the Rust code and come up with some kind of simpler representation, whether it's data tables like I'm using for the economy, which are literally tables in a text file which are being loaded, or a kind of custom specific language for architecture or what have you. So the modders, it would be easy both for me and for the modders to change like simple things, but modders will have the full power to change whatever they wanted. And we use version control systems as a really powerful way to create combinations of mods to deal with incompatibilities between mods in a way that makes it easy for even two different developers to recognize that their mods are incompatible and working together to create a combination of the mods that actually works together. It makes a lot easier the thing, like if I create a new version of the game, I see which mods are still compatible with that on a source code level. If I created any conflicts there, it will show the mod makers exactly which parts they need to change to make it compatible with the new version. Yeah, that's the plan. Chokma asked, do I know of any game that does modding like you plan successfully? That's a great question. I should look that up. And I think it's important to weigh off the pros and cons. It means that modders would have to learn version control systems, which is not that big of a deal. I think what we get in return is an existing, really well thought out system for exactly the problem of tons of unrelated people working on the same code together. And it should be able to deal with the kind of problems that you always end up having when you make extensive modding possible, much nicer to deal with rather than pretending that they don't exist and limiting yourself because of that. Is that kind of clear?
Well, while we wait for Chokma's response, Joey, who just joined us, has said in the Google Hangouts chat that he's on listen-only mode today because he's got drywall guys currently working in the background. It's incredibly noisy for him.
If you have a question, feel free to quickly enable your microphone and shout something at us. Yeah, and technically it would be unmoddable, but also completely moddable. And an important aspect of that is that the game would always come with its own source code. So like if you download the installer, the source code is encoded and you don't have to like spend a lot of time getting modding tools or whatever. You could actually start changing stuff and then try it out with the game. Yeah, with the choice of Rust, I limited the number of modders. With that type of modding, you will limit it even further. Okay, you're definitely right about Rust. My answer to that is, like I said, I want to pull out the most important things into simpler formats or languages. And I think I want to try this first to see if maybe I can't create a nice UI for modders. Hi, Marco.
Hello.
Nice that you joined us. I think it could really be possible to not only make this a viable alternative, but maybe even make it a more usable alternative for modders. This is my hope. So, hi, Marco. Thank you for joining.
Hi. I just really am interested in this game upcoming, and I am quite interested in the economy and like how resource chains will eventually be done.
Okay.
And I might even do some mods for that if you think that it would be a bit too complex.
Very cool. I think someone else asked about resource chains earlier.
Yeah, and I'd put up my hand to mod resource chains as well.
And great, so you can already start collaborating there. So resource change are naturally possible in the way I designed the economy right now, where businesses have resources which they own and their desires modeled as well. And you can, of course, create very simple mechanisms that transform one kind of resource into another kind of resource. And then just the kind of universal concept of families and businesses trying to find the best offer for a resource which they need would lead to markets. And I think we talked about this previously. The holy grail of where I want to get is that it's even possible for pure logistics companies to realize that, oh, this company needs this resource in its resource chain, and this company, maybe even in another country, produces it. So if I buy a couple trucks and have them go from the airport to this company, I can make a profit. So ideally, you can even have resource chains with the outside world and logistics.
Oh, that's something that I wanted to have in the game. It sounds so interesting.
And something that's always been interesting to me is that just about, without fail, every single major, large, international famous city in the world has become that way because of trade.
Mm-hmm.
Exactly.
That by building these large logistics networks, you grow a city. That's how cities grow. And so that's the fuel for the fire for making huge, spectacular cities in this game.
Yeah, that would be amazing. And as towards the depth and why modding might be necessary, I think just for the sake of balancing the economy and making sure that it's stable at all, I will go for a really simple selection of resources and a really simple selection of resource chains, just so that I don't have too much chaotic behavior to try to get to work. But definitely it's possible for modders to create the most detailed and complex resource chains imaginable.
Yeah, that sounds really good.
Cool. So maybe Marco, do you want to, since I made this kind of a tradition, just quickly introduce yourself and who you are, how you found out about Citybound, and yeah.
I'm Marco Meza on Simtropolis. My current username is Akram's Razor. It's a funny little pun.
Oh, that's you. Okay, I see.
And on Reddit, and most other places, I'm Azimakram, which is my name backwards. And I've been following Citybound for a long time. I don't know how I originally found out about it. It was probably Simtropolis, like back during the very early days.
Nice. I didn't expect that at all, but now I feel stupid for not realizing that that's just your name backwards. Because
most people don't recognize that.
No, because you're definitely one of these like user handles which I just immediately recognize in my head whenever there's a new. See, even Inge recognizes you as well. Okay. I don't know if you have the chat open, but you're basically already a celebrity. So I think I think I missed what Joey said earlier in the speech bubble. Did you see that,
He's
Justin?
saying that with this kind of system, this kind of modding system that you were talking about before, you could have modders who write higher level abstractions that you want to see. So that way it kind of forms these mod packs or SDKs.
Yeah, that's something that I didn't even get into, where modders cannot just directly write mods, but write whole new like tools or systems which other mods can then depend on. So,
and I mean, all like your conventional player would need would be like a NAM equivalent, network add-on mod equivalent, or like a big beautification mod, some huge pack of several mods that just enhances every aspect of the game they would want it to, and everything else is just content.
Yeah.
You know, what type of police car you have, what architecture building you're getting, what texture pack you're running, that's all just content.
Exactly. And I mean, maybe the situation that I described earlier sounds chaotic, where everyone completely modifies the source code, but it would actually make it easier for people to maintain mod packs that are popular, because then you could have one person that makes sure that all of these different modifications work together, are in line, and you can just conveniently get as a whole package. Okay, so I'm planning to finish up in maybe 10 minutes. I think I want to give Marco the chance to ask a couple more questions since he just joined. And Joey, feel free to continue asking things with your subtle text bubbles.
I'm the voice of Joey.
So what is the type of resource chain economy that you're planning for version 1? Without mods, your version.
Let me give a couple examples to illustrate it without having to completely specify it. So for example, there's only food. It's not more differentiated than that. But you could still have restaurants, and they would not be equivalent to supermarkets offering food, because restaurants at the same time also offer like cultural life resource for a higher total price. And I think by having these kind of categories of resources that are simple in themselves, but the combinations of which can still produce complicated behaviors is what I want to go for in version 1.0.
Oh, cool, good.
Now, I remember when you did the February live stream about planning the economic engine, you did write down a simplistic resource.
Yeah, exactly. That's
system.
what I meant.
I'm just trying to find it right now.
That's still roughly what I'm going for, or pretty exactly what I'm going for. And it was definitely worthwhile to try to come up with the set of resources, because even though the economic model, the dynamics of it became, or the mechanics of it became a lot simpler, this is still exactly the minimal set of resources that would make sense in the beginning.
Oh, yeah, here we go. So I found the GitHub post where Marco and myself went back and forth to polish
so that was
list.
actually you. Perfect.
So.
By the way, Joey, I saw your question. I'll get back to it in a second.
Now let's go through Joe's question now, because while we went back and forth, we didn't actually end up making it one list.
Okay.
And yeah, you should pay me. I'll charge you by the hour. That's what he recommends. That's not my advice.
Okay.
So Anselm, what is the next planned milestone that we'll be able to play with, along the lines of the roads prototype?
So the next milestone is exactly the minimal version of economy, where you have abstract representations of building, like maybe just a square on the ground, which is connected to a road where cars come from and go to. And you can click on a building and see a list of people who either live there or are currently there. You can see which family they belong to. For each family and business, you can see which resources it has, like how well they're doing on each resource. People actually have their daily life where they just try to keep all their resources in balance. And they are forcefully spawned, just like right now you forcefully spawn cars. This won't be possible anymore in the next prototype, but you will forcefully spawn random buildings. Like there won't be any demand modeling yet for certain businesses or families. You basically just randomly create this set of families and businesses, and they can hope to be lucky and get a job, and the businesses can hope and be lucky to get some customers. And then they will do their thing, and maybe they will end up in horrible debt or become super rich, and it might all be crazy, but we can observe that and learn from that and start improving the model from there. That's, I would say, the milestone for the next prototype.
Yeah, that sounds good.
Cool. I would say let's do 2 more questions, one from you guys calling in and one from the chat. I will just pick my favorite ones and then we'll call it a day.
You're all crazy, Inga says.
Just a comment, Inge would like to create a family according to some specification and see how well they fare. That's an interesting idea.
Interests and needs sounds interesting. Like maybe they have certain desires for certain types of entertainment or culture or whatever you want to call it, and different types of services, like such as more interested in like a quiet, safe, secure neighborhood, or more interested in like a more artsy neighborhood, and access to like museums. And
yeah, that's definitely a challenge given these pretty simple resource categories. How do you actually make people unique and different in a meaningful way? Are you selling the end game or shares into this project like an ICO? What is an ICO? So my plan is to do something kind of schizophrenic where the game continues to be open source, but I also sell it on Steam for a fixed price. So far it's just open source with the support of my lovely patrons, but I've seen at least one game that successfully did that, and surprisingly people still paid even though it's technically free. And yeah, since piracy is a thing anyways and is huge and you can't do anything about it, I think that's about the best way to go about it, and I definitely want to try that first.
I'm
Cool.
currently in the process of taking this list of a resource management chain that we worked on back in February, and I'm trying to make a graph out of it.
Oh wow, that sounds
It'll take a few minutes.
both cool and useful.
I made a really haphazard graph in Inkscape and it didn't look very good. And then somebody else just did a basic generic resource chain somewhere. And I think I posted that on the forums and maybe even Reddit.
Yeah, feel free to again post such stuff on Reddit. I'm sure people will love it. Dimitri asked, will there be cable cars and monorails? Well, that
I hope so.
That will be very simple mods of light rail. Has Joey spoken yet? No, Joey, let us hear the construction going on. Maybe it's just an excuse and he's actually really shy. All right, I think we are done for today. Thank you all very much for participating. Like always, it was tons of fun. I just realized, I think, that I forgot to look at the camera and not at all you lovely people. So probably when people watch it later, it looks like I'm constantly looking down, but whatever. It was a lot of fun. Lots of interesting topics discussed as always. I will try to do the next Patrons Calling again in roughly 2 weeks, even though there's exams, but that doesn't matter much.
Exams are really important.
Yeah, that's why I learn a full 2 days for each one. So yeah, OPEC Clarity was just wondering how I intend to make a profit. So right now Patreon is already really promising, and as the game progresses, I think more people will be interested in not just trying it out, but also supporting the project. And then later on for the mass market, if you will, I just want to do the classical selling it while also keeping it open source. All right. Thank you all very much for joining us again. Stay tuned for the next one, which again will be open. I think it was a great idea to have more people joining, and enjoy your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.